I'm very honored to be here. I just wanted to thank all of the prestigious universities and organizations hosting this event, and the Mufti of Istanbul, and my good friend and colleague, Dr. Suleiman Dern, for inviting me here. And I apologize, I'm going to speak in English, so you have to bear with me through another, being patient with the translation. I appreciate your patience. I'm going to speak about sort of connecting what Professor Malik Badri was talking about in terms of the foundations of a worldview of Islam, giving forth to an actual unique paradigm of Islamic psychology, working from within that, and then also what the sister was talking about in terms of spirituality, the need for it to be in application and not just in theory. Accepted that we have an Islamic psychology, moving forward with understanding what does this actually look like in practice in terms of psychotherapy, and starting to delineate and define what this needs to look like. So briefly, just the difference between a lot of times people integrate Islamic principles into an already Western foundation of psychology. And Professor Badri has referenced this as like putting an Islamic paint over a decrepit building. That you can't expect for the building to work just because we have painted it with Islam. We need to change the foundations. And so, working from within this paradigm, it reorients the entire purpose of something like psychotherapy. So everything from assessment, diagnosis to the treatment goals becomes a different approach. And I would say, one of the things that oftentimes psychotherapy can be is just coping with a person's difficulties in life. So not necessarily understanding that there is an actual ability to transform and transcend the problems, but trying to renegotiate and help people cope with their problems. And from an Islamic perspective, because we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the true healer, we believe that there is an actual way to be transformed. And so instead of just making comfort with the discomfort, being okay with the discomfort, it's understanding that within these difficulties are opportunities to become closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be transformed. So from this perspective, the result, or what somebody is working towards in terms of treatment goals, wellness and psychological health, is not necessarily defined just as a removal of symptoms or even just as functioning in the daily, in the world. It is really a broader scope of definition of what wellness and health is, and really at the heart of this, from an Islamic perspective, is nearness to Allah. The whole point of life in the dunya is to uncover what has covered ourselves from witnessing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so health is our trajectory of development and growth towards this witnessing. So it's not looking at these two things as separate, as psychology and health and wellness on one hand in coping with the dunya, and then religion and Islam in understanding our connection to Allah and our souls and our spirit. These two things need to come together, because ultimately Islam is a pathway for health and wellness and wholeness in the human being. And our conception from Islam of the human being includes the soul, which is the psyche, which is the study of the psyche. So everything we're talking about in psychology, it's not to make a distinction or a binary between these two things, but to see them as one thing. And that what we're looking at in terms of Islamic psychotherapy is not just plugging the person back into their dunya life to be comfortable, but it is, and not just dealing with the self that starts from birth and ends at death, our notion of who we are. It's dealing with the true self, the nafs, the soul, that starts from before birth and after death. So we're talking, prenatal and post-mortem. We're including the akhirah in the treatment plan. So because of this, because we have constructed this idea of these two things being together in a truly Islamic form of psychotherapy, then we have to understand that spiritual direction is ultimately a part of this process. So oftentimes we have seen as spiritual direction only in the hands, in the domain of the imams or the sheikh, because they have the knowledge, the book knowledge maybe. But we need to understand that there are a lot of the real shayukh, the real people who understood not only the knowledge in the book, but how to apply this knowledge, the ma'rifah, the actual experiential knowledge of how that looks and how it's applied. Unfortunately, there's less and less of these righteous, pious scholars. And so, not only do the imams and the shayukh of today need to understand how, like the sister was saying, how this applies to daily life, translating the notions of spirituality from theory into practice, but also we need to understand that in psychotherapy, this is a venue for people to get this type of direction. So there needs to be an allowance for spiritual direction to be within this place, which means there's a lot of responsibility on the therapist then in this situation. So fortunately for us, this is not necessarily a new idea, and it's something we can, like Professor Malik's saying, we can always come back to understanding that this is within our tradition, it's within Islam. So Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali in the Ihya Ulumuddin, also we draw from this a lot because this is such a treasure, he mentions two pathways to self-awareness. So he talks about wellness or spiritual health being, the heart of it is self-awareness, having an understanding of the self. And he presents two pathways for this. One is that you take a sheikh, that you have a sheikh of tasawwuf who understands on a very intricate level, the understanding of the soul from the Islamic perspective, and can actually help a person travel in the path to developing their soul. But then, he says, even in his time, he says it is very rare to find a person like this. To find a true sheikh who can guide a person on the path in this way. So therefore, he says, he doesn't say that it's possible to do it without. You still need another person to help guide you. So then he presents that the second pathway is to take a rafiq, a sound companion, one who is familiar with the intricacies of the matter of self-awareness. And so this is where I propose the position of the Islamic psychotherapist can be. So what he presents in this is that the rafiq, the sound companion, the reason that they're sound is because of the state of their heart. Meaning that they have done an enormous amount of self-reflection. They've journeyed into themselves to understand, because he who knows himself knows his Lord. And so it is based upon this work on the self that gives somebody the ability to then hold this position. And it's then reframing what the psychotherapist is. It's not somebody who goes to school to learn techniques and administers techniques to then render the person healthy, like a medical model. It's not that we're delivering treatment and that the result of the treatment is to remove it or is to cause the healing. We understand that all of these things are asbab, right? And so Allah is the healer. The healing is coming from Allah, not from the technique that's being administered. So then we have to understand what is the actual mechanism that allows for Allah to come into this process of the healing. So like we've heard, Allah does not change the people until they change what is in themselves. So the process is the person reflecting on themselves and changing what is in themselves as the client or the person receiving the therapy. But the way that this is enacted is using tools within the therapeutic encounter to encourage self-reflection. It's not, like I said, administering techniques. And so this is talked about in Western psychology. Someone by the name of Baldwin has talked about the idea of the self as instrument. So that there is something about the self of the therapist that is the instrument for the therapy taking place. And in our tradition, we have this. The hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, the believer is a mirror to the fellow believer. So this idea of the mirror is that through the connection and interaction with the other in relationship, we are able to come closer to Allah in this reflection of the ruh that's inside of each and every person. And what happens is, in order for this mirror to be reflective of Allah rather than the nafs, is that mirror needs to be polished. The cleaner the mirror, the less turbid the mirror, the more clear the reflection. And thus, the more that the person is getting out of the way so that the other person can come in contact with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that there's a transmission that happens from heart to heart. And so, when you're entering into this state, it is a very intimate process. It is very different from the idea that the person who is the therapist is in a position of power or distance from the process, because it's two human beings in relationship to one another. And that through this heart-to-heart connection, the transmission happens. But in order to have this be a clear transmission and not get nafs in the way of nafs, so that there's feeding in on identification with the self instead of the ruh, there needs to be this state of the therapist needs to be cultivated. So the state of the therapist, his heart, is not a passive state. It's not something that just somebody achieves and can then live from this place. It is something that has to be constantly cultivated in a process of tazkiyah. So I wanted to just read to you something from my research. So I do research on this topic, and I have researched many people who are doing this type of Islamic psychotherapy, who are trained in the knowledge of the soul from tasawwuf, but also trained in psychology, and really not just integrating, but really coming from this model of understanding the state. And I thought that this excerpt from my research is a good summary of this. So she says, my feeling of Islamic psychology is that the base is suhbah, companionship. And in companionship, you're not just physically with the person, not just emotionally with the person, but your heart is literally on the table with the person. And when it's like that, almost like a veil is lifted between us, and these problems become clear. So even the client will tell me, I've been sitting here and I say things and I'm so amazed at what I'm figuring out about myself, even though you've said nothing. And then she says, but that only happens when I'm in a state where I'm able to be open. So then how does one get into this state? So like this participant said, it happens when I'm in this state and I'm open. So this is something, like I said, it needs to be cultivated. So how to cultivate a sound heart becomes now a matter of professional development when we look at it in this model. So that not only does a person be studying techniques and studying, like let's say we go to a training on cognitive behavioral therapy to learn this technique. Instead, I mean, this is helpful as well, but really the base of this work is cleaning the heart. And so the professional development almost becomes an ethical obligation in this sense, that the therapist needs to constantly be working on their own heart and doing their own work of self-reflection. And so just going back to Ghazali's two pathways, ideally the person in this position as an Islamic psychotherapist, as a sound companion, the Rafiq, really also should have a sheikh or a sound companion. Because you always need another party to reflect what is happening in your heart. If we rely on ourselves, we will get stuck. We will delude ourselves into thinking we're better off than we are. So it is important that we have guidance in this matter. But then the tools for how to have a sound heart are things that are in our tradition, that they're all the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that we have to understand these as actual indications or prescriptions of how to do this. So muhasabah, having self-reflection, taking account of the self on a daily basis. This is something essential for an Islamic psychotherapist. Muraqabah and tafakkur, this is how you cultivate this state. Nawafil prayer, dhikr, qiyam al-layl, these things increase capacity for a person to be able to not only get themselves out of the way, but be able to stay anchored in Allah for this person, and as well as fasting and exercise, because they help a person stay grounded in their body to be able to absorb and work with these people in such a deep way. So just to close, this obviously brings a big it's a big responsibility to position somebody who's thinking of this as a profession. Oftentimes people they go to school, they learn something to have a profession to make money. But if we think of Islamic psychotherapy in this way, it becomes quite a big responsibility for somebody to have the weight on their shoulders to help to think of this as spiritual direction. And so it really shifts. It's a different paradigm. And it's something that, in order for a person to do this, it can't just be about a profession. It's not the same as becoming an engineer or a chemist, let's say, in that it is something very delicate and it's something very personal that a person has to embark on this journey. And so it puts into focus this idea of how it relates to professional ethics then in this arena. So it is about putting this ethical obligation is really, it's about akhlaq, the akhlaq of the therapist, the work that they have been doing on themselves in order to really be in a position to do this work. And so then it becomes how to assess whether somebody is able to do this. This is the challenge that I think we have as we start to develop this as an actual profession, is to distinguish it. This is a very new idea. Usually we have thought of psychology as it doesn't really matter whether the state of the person is. Although in Western psychology they're moving towards this more. And I think there is a lot that we can do to sort of catch up with them in ways, even though we are much more advanced in these ways. But so the work that we've been doing with Professor Malik Badri, we under his guidance, he's the president of the International Association of Islamic Psychology, that we began our work about 2 years ago, but this has been in the works for the past, 40 years, but really 8 years in specifically, and it's to start to define this as a profession while maintaining the Islamic integrity and maintaining the spiritual core of this work, so that it doesn't become watered down and it doesn't become, we have to maintain Islamic integrity as well as the integrity of a professional field. And so this is quite a challenge, and we are trying to establish this as a community. There's a lot of people, I'm sure many of whom are in this audience, who have been doing similar work for quite a long time, have been doing the integration of Islam and psychology. But oftentimes we do this in isolation. And what can happen is we get sort of disaggregated. And so we need to come together as a community to start to define the parameters of this and to be able to maintain this Islamic integrity. So we have established curriculums and courses, certification in Islamic psychology and psychotherapy that is all based in the knowledge of the Quran, from the knowledge of the soul from the Quran and Sunnah, in partnership with the ulama. And this is something that is really, really important, to not see this as a binary, not to see it as just psychology and then the imams and the shaykh over here. We need to work together. The imams and the shaykh also need to understand psychology so that they can deliver the spiritual knowledge to the people in this time. And so I think we need to work together. We're doing a lot of this work, partnering with imams and doing trainings in Islamic psychology. And so we have a lot of work to do, and we invite everybody to join us in this work. You can visit our website, islamic-psychology.org, and you can become a member to the association, and you can help us with research and really developing this field, because there is plenty of work to do. And I think not only for the Muslim community, but for the world, really needs this knowledge that Islam has to offer. Thank you so much. I appreciate your attention. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.